Okay, thank you very much. Let me get closer to the mic so it'll work. Um, I'm the facilitator, so I have to introduce us. So many of you have known me. Carol and I came 7 years to Oak Hammock, and 5 months ago we moved to assisted living. And Jack came a couple of years ago, and he and Nancy have been very active in various things that are going on. So Jack was one of the most important people on a submarine. He was a baker, and and you'll see that he spent a lot of time on different submarines because when they went to sea for a patrol, which is what we call going out for more than 2 or 3 weeks, uh, they wanted a baker on board, so they set the hook and reeled him in for that. So, and the other thing about Jack, he lived in Annapolis longer than I did because his father was a West Point graduate and they had a house in Annapolis while he was in the Pentagon. So Jack graduated from high school in Annapolis and I graduated from the other place. Was it the same year? 59? Wow. You're a youngster. Okay, what is a submarine? We're going to talk about that a little bit. How do you make one and why do you use them? And then we're going to show you some pictures and who are these men. And now they have women in submarines. This is new. Started a few years ago. In fact, one of the submarine ladies is also an astronaut. Okay, now I'm going to let Jack talk. We need another microphone.
Okay, the first slide showed my rate, which was when I got out as CS3 SS. That back in those days was commissaryman, third class SS qualified in submarines. Today, it's culinary specialist. So they kept the CS, but they changed the names because now we have women on board, and a lot of them are, not a lot, but a few of them are in the galley cooking. So anyway, this was my first all expense paid trip to Greece, courtesy of the U.S. government. And that's my dress uniform. It was wintertime in Greece, and we were on blues. And that's one of the Ebzones, one of the Greek special forces. They guard the tomb of the unknown soldier. And that was at the Olympic Stadium that was built in, for the 1902 Olympics, I think it was. The first Olympics again held in Greece. And so that's what that's all about. The patch that just went up was the first boat I was on, the tench. Tench is a freshwater trout found in Europe, and the patches that you see were developed by the commissioning crews and held with, so that patches came with the boat all the way through. The commissioning crews are also then the plank owners. The second boat I was on was the Conger, which is an eel. It's, even though they tried to make it look like a torpedo. And then the Angler. The Angler was, the reason it's got headphones on was it was modified for acoustic sonar work, and had a lot of sonar gear on board, and that was that one. And then the Bakuna, which is interesting because I was visiting my daughter up in Philadelphia and took a walk along the waterfront, and there was the Bakuna. They took my boat and made a museum piece out of it. So we had a lot of fun with that one. And then the last boat I was on was the Diablo, and that's the one that we were getting ready to turn over to the Pakistanis just before I got out of the Navy.
Okay, this is a younger version of me. My first submarine was really for a midshipman cruise. So this was in June of 1958 in Key West. And in those days, you could buy a Vespa motor scooter for $65 from somebody used. And if at the end of the time you wanted to sell it, it sold for $65 if it still ran. And so that was the thread fin. It was great I enjoyed it, and that's when I decided I probably wanted to be a submariner. And besides that, I flunked the physical for flight. So these, now on the left, you will see the silver dolphins, and that's what the enlisted men were when they got qualified on submarines, which would take 6 to 9 months or a year, because they had to know how to do everything on the submarine. So Jack probably knew how to start the diesel engines and operate a whole bunch of other things. The gold is for the officers, and typically the officers went to sub school for 6 months and then went to a submarine. After they had been at sea on destroyers, I went directly to a submarine, and I qualified in a year, never having gone to sub school, and I never had to go through the tower. Did you go through the tower, Jack?
I'm sorry?
Did you go through the tower?
Oh, yeah, a couple of times.
That's a 100-foot tower. You go in at the bottom and you float up, shouting ho, ho, ho all the way up so you don't blow up your lungs with the air pressure from 100 feet.
It was to teach you to escape from the sunken submarine, which was fine as long as you were in coastal waters, but if you sank in the deep, you were gone. Can you back up just a minute? Interesting thing that a lot of people don't understand, we call them dolphins, and it's because what you're looking at is a dolphin fish, a mahi-mahi or a dorado. These were developed, insignias were developed in the early 20s when they started going from numbers for submarines and started naming them after fish. And so they came up with the dolphin fish as the insignia.
And it's an insignia we wear on a uniform with pride. So what are the hazards of submarining? I'm going to show you exactly what the hazards are. This was drawn by our son when he was in grade school, and I don't know how he figured out that looks to me like a Russian November class submarine. So I didn't have that hazard. So what is a submarine? It's a vessel that can be submerged, navigate underwater, usually built for warfare, and it's also armed with torpedoes, guided missiles, and now with some torpedo tube launched land attack missiles. More importantly, it's one that can return to the surface. Now, I don't know if you saw Jack's shirt, but it says some boats are designed to sink, submarines are designed to sink, and others need assistance.
Yeah, sea story, I was on one of the boats, we were making our 5,000th dive, and so the captain had me make a big sheet cake with all that on it, and he came back to look at it, and I said, Captain, I understand that this is important, but I really think we ought to be celebrating the 5,000th surface. And that didn't go over very well.
So here's the submarine equation. If S, the number of surfaces, equals D, the number of dives, you've been a very successful submariner. So far, good for us. Okay, there are only two kinds of ships, submarines and targets. The skimmers don't like that. Okay, what is the purpose of a submarine? Primary purpose is to sink enemy ships and lay mines. And cargo ships, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but also launch land attack missiles like they did in the recent 12-day war, 1 day for the US. Something like 75 Tomahawk missiles were launched from submarines while submerged at targets in Iran. And strategic deterrence. You'll see later one of my submarines, I spent close to a year total time underwater carrying around my Polaris missiles, and you guys are real lucky I brought every one of them back. Okay, secondary purposes are surveillance, and we'll see a picture of that in a little while. Clandestine operations, which not too many people talk about very much. But I have a book here, if someone would like to borrow it later, written by my good friend Charlie McVane, who talks about some of his exploits. And he's the most decorated submarine CO in recent times for the things that he did, some of which he still can't talk about. Okay, one of the other things that doesn't happen so much anymore is a submarine burial at sea. Years ago, submariners were allowed to request burial at sea, and sometimes it was ashes overboard, and other times it was being shot out of a torpedo tube. You can see there the man in the closest right is a senior chief petty officer, and he's probably the chief of the boat. We'll talk about that later. The guy next to him, much shorter, is the commanding officer of that submarine, and his pins are the gold dolphins at the top. The chief has his silver dolphins at the top, and the captain has his Polaris patrol pin below. And the other people are there, and as usually we didn't have a gunner's mate, but there was a torpedoman who acted as gunner mate, and here he's probably doing the salute to the burial process. There's a submarine memorial at the Naval Academy for all those who are still on eternal patrol. And those are the submariners who did not come back in World War II. They're still on eternal patrol, and they're honored by the rest of us for their valor. The bell up there came from a submarine named the Paddle, and you can't read the rest of it, I'm sorry. But there's two recent submarines that were lost, the Thresher, which was the lead ship of the class of the ship I was on, and the Scamp, wasn't it? Scorpion, I'm sorry, thank you. The Thresher went down on sea trials out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were at test depth, and they had flooding in the auxiliary machinery room, and that shut the whole thing down. It's a long story, I won't get into it. The Scamp was lost coming back from Europe, somewhere near the Azores. And both of these submarines have been found and explored by the Navy. Okay, when are they used in wars? The enemy must use the sea lanes in order to conduct the war. Think of England in World War I and II. Or the enemy has a large fleet that's bottled up our fleet, so you want to go try to get rid of some of their fleet. And the World Wars I and II illustrated that very well. The UK could not have survived without all of the cargo ships and transport ships for the troops going to England from the US principally. January, the Kaiser ordered unlimited, unrestricted submarine warfare in home waters. And that was the beginning, really, of the big submarine battles of World War I and World War II, where the Germans had an advantage in number of submarines and their willingness to go through the problems that they had with their limited capability, but they were very good. There's a book in the library here, Jack and I have both read it. It's Codename Nemo, N-E-M-O, and it's about the capture of the German submarine 505 or 555? 505 in World War II. Very interesting book. Okay.
Which is now a museum piece up in Chicago.
Okay, and excuse me, so now USA and Japan in World War II. Japan was an island nation that depended heavily for everything on everywhere else in their, for oil, for steel, for anything they needed to support their war machine. They had to bring it in by ship. The U.S. Navy submarines were responsible for sinking most of the Japanese warships and cargo ships and transports during the war. So a very small number of submarines did a great deal of damage to the Japanese fleet. So how are they used? Cargo ships in the World War II and earlier were typically like 6, 7, 8 knots. They were cheap. You didn't want to waste money making them go faster. But if you set up a convoy like they did to protect the ships from the submarines, then the convoy had to go at the slowest speed. Actually, it was the fastest speed of the slowest ship. So they were going 6 to 9 knots in the convoy. So how do you do that? The submarine speed on the surface was like 20 knots, and submerged was like 6 or 8 or 10 knots for a brief period of time. So they did an end around, and they ran around to get in front of the convoy. Then they would submerge and then attack the convoy. In the early days of World War II and all of World War I, there was no good way to detect submarines either on the surface or at periscope depth. So they had an advantage. And then radar came along and other signals detection, and the submarines were in hazardous waters, whether they were submerged or with their periscopes and antennas up, could be targets. And the aircraft were able to find a lot of them. So submarines submerged for periscope attack, but if it was a single cargo ship, they could run around, get in front, surface, and use their deck guns to sink the ship. And early in the wars, the German submarines were somewhat nicer than later because they would frequently surface, radio the ship, and tell them, everybody leave, we're going to sink your ship. And so they were able to get in lifeboats, and sometimes they were saved. And 1 or 2 times, I believe, German submarines actually took some passengers on board. But if you have seen Das Boot, you know that there's no room in a German submarine for extra people. Submarines are vulnerable on or near the surface, not so vulnerable underwater. So what is the submarine history? Revolutionary War, the US had the submarine turtle. So the submarine service is as old as the Army and as old as the Navy, about 250 years old, but it's not recognized. I'll show you why in a minute. The Civil War, the South had the Hunley, which is now on display in Charleston, South Carolina. It's been recovered. We'll look at that in a minute. And the World War I submarines were very primitive, and so they were limited in their engineering and technical capability. But between the wars, there were great improvements made, and my first real assignment to a submarine was a diesel submarine, copying a lot of the German technology, and we'll see that later. Okay, snorkel was first introduced later in World War II by the Germans, and so they could run their diesel engines underwater with the snorkel up. But the snorkel made a bigger target for radar. So it was a great improvement, and they could go faster submerged with the snorkel than they could just running on the battery. We'll look at batteries in a little while, but the submarines typically had a half-hour rate, which means you could run your ship submerged on the battery for a half an hour and maybe go 9 or 10, maybe 11 knots, depending on the submarine. And then you had to come up and recharge the battery. So every day, every diesel submarine had to come to the surface in order to charge their batteries so they could be submerged for limited amounts of time while they were doing their attacks. So okay, I can't see it up there. 1950s and later, the nuclear submarines came in, and they were a real tremendous improvement in submarine technology. until the nukes were around, submarines were surface warships that could submerge for limited amounts of time. With the nukes, you can surface for a limited amount of time, and you can go, now the reactors are designed to last for 35 years without having to be refueled. So the limitation on a nuclear submarine is when will you run out of food? And in order to solve part of that problem, we would stack the number 10 cans, which are the big cans about so, on the deck throughout the submarine, lay plywood down on top of it and walk around on it till we needed to eat them.
Go back to the half-hour rate on diesel electric submarines for a moment. That's at top speed. If you push the metal to the pedal to the metal and went as fast as you could, you'd burn your batteries out in a half hour. If you dinked along at 1 or 2 knots, you could stay down for a couple of days without a problem.
And the ventilation got bad. So the submarine structure it's very traditional, like the Royal Navy. The officers and the enlisted men were distinct, separate groups of people on the same ship. And the officers have a privileged social status or social structure. The commanding officer is always called captain. That doesn't matter what his rank is. If you were on a little tugboat and you were a lieutenant, you were still called captain if you were the captain. Most of the captains on the diesel boats were senior lieutenant commanders. Occasionally, a guy would make commander before he was transferred off, but he was still called captain. The officers addressed, can't read, I have to have a bigger text when I do that. Officers are addressed as Mr. by the crew. The officers and the XO and below are all on a first name basis. So sometimes you'd call the XO, and sometimes you would just call him John or whatever his first name was. And he called all of us the same, and the captain called us by our first names unless he was mad at us. Then it was Lieutenant Wynn, get in here. So CO and XO had one-man staterooms, and we'll see some of those in a minute. Other officers were in 3-man bunks, sometimes with curtains, sometimes with a door, if you were on a nuke. So the other officers, 3-man bunk. The wardroom mess meals were served by stewards, which at the time was a separate ranking, and they were typically young black enlisted men or young Filipinos. Filipinos had the ability to come to the U.S. Navy and serve as mess stewards. And later on, it was opened up for everybody to strike, as it was called. You wanted to be a strike for electricians maid or machinist maid. Everybody could strike for whatever rank they wanted. So the stewards made the beds and served the meals. It was like serving here, except a little bit better. And submarine, we had good food, I have to tell you. And
one thing on the diesel boats, especially, is that the officers ate the same thing as the enlisted men. It all came out of the same galley. There was one cook and served the crew.
And the same on the nukes. So we ate all the same food, but we had good food. They did our laundry, cleaned our living spaces. So submarine crew, enlisted. You want to talk about this one, Jack?
Sure. Enlisted went usually on the boats. You were E2, which meant a seaman recruit up to E9 or 10, which was chief petty officer, right? The senior chief on board was called the Cobb, the chief of the boat, and he's the one that sat by the ballast tank valve manifold when we dove. And then the rest of the crew, of course, was various specialties: electricians, machinist mates, engine men, torpedo men, cooks, the sonarman, radio man, whatever your job rating was, there we were. Usually the officers called us by our last names. There was very little fraternization, although discipline was reasonably relaxed on the boats because of such close quarters. The officers called the chief's chief or Chief Jones, by their last name. The usually up in the forward battery is one of the rooms, if you will, was the goat locker. That's where the chief slept. So they were up in officer country and separated from the enlisted crew. And then the rest of us slept in predominantly three different places: forward torpedo room, after battery, or the after torpedo room. And the youngest on board usually didn't have an assigned bunk, so they would hot bunk. One slept, and then when that guy went on duty, the off-duty guy would climb into the hot bunk. The officers that had their wardroom, they had communal meals up there. The crew had a mess, usually 4 tables. We could feed 24 people at a time, and usually the oncoming watch, and then the off-going watch, and then the guys who are in between would just kind of show up and eat whenever. And we on the diesel boats we had a corpsman, usually a second or first class corpsman, always called Doc, and that was our medical resource.
We had the dock and Band-Aids. So the submarine crew at sea, they were different for nukes and different for the diesel boats. So generally 3 4-hour shifts with rotating crew. And we were 6 and 12 on the nukes because it just worked out better. And when we left port, we set our clocks to Greenwich Mean Time. So all the times on the logs and everything were in Greenwich Mean Time. So you didn't have to worry about changing your clocks as you crossed the ocean. So the officer of the deck is in the submerged. He's in the control room. When you're on the surface, you're on the bridge, and he's in charge of driving the ship. And that was one of the most fun jobs I had. The chief of the watch, as Jack said, would be at the ballast control station. We're going to see these in a little while. And he was in charge. He had the microphone there. He could, if the captain said to dive the ship, he would pick up the microphone, sound the klaxon, and say, "Dive, dive." And then the officer of the deck on the bridge had to get down, close the hatch, and say, "Last man down, that hatch secured." And then the chief of the boat would be looking at his indicators to make sure that all the valves that were supposed to be shut were shut, and the valves that were supposed to be open were open. The diving officer was at the diving stand. The diving officer's job was very simple: reach and maintain ordered depth. So if the captain said 100 feet, you went to 100 feet, and that's where you stayed. And his job was to pump water in and out as necessary to balance the boat. So the plainsman and the helmsman became, we'll see their stations, the bow planes, stern planes, and the helm in a minute. And on the surface, you had one guy on the helm, and you had one lookout on the bridge. When you were first getting underway, you had 2 lookouts on the bridge with the officer of the deck, junior officer of the deck, and possibly another person, and the captain. And if you ordered starboard back 1/3, port ahead 1/3, then the lookouts would look and tell you if from the wash from the propeller, if they were actually doing what you ordered. So submerged, these guys were all down at the diving station, and we'll see that in a little bit. The engineers, it's different on nukes. We had commissioned engineers for the nuclear submarines, and they had to have gone through nuclear power training, and they mainly stayed aft where the power plant was and the reactor. And their job was to make sure everything was working back there. And if the captain wanted to go at flank speed, they fixed it so it would do that. So you also had electronics and radiomen and sonar operators, and they had their various watch stations to listen for what was around you and report. And the cooks and the messmen, and here was the cook. And we'll see some of their locations. So in port, typically you had 1/3 of the crew on board at any one time. And that crew had to be capable of getting the submarine underway as needed if you needed to change berths or do something, avoid the hurricane or whatever. You had to be able to get underway with 1/3 of the crew for a limited amount of time. And I did that one time. And then the captain came back from where he had been overnight and saw me out in the middle of the parking area trying to repark the boat. We had to move. We were down in St. Croix, and cruise ships had the right of way. So the duty officer has to be a qualified officer of the deck because he needs to be able to get the ship underway as necessary. And in nukes, you had to have a qualified engineering officer of the watch and probably 2 more to run the reactor plant. Typically, the nukes ran their reactor plant once they got underway, the whole time they were underway, or if they were in port, because if you go into a European port, their electricity doesn't match ours, so you keep the nuke running, keep the generators going and the air conditioning. So, like I said, 1 underway watch station, so the crew had to be divided up, enlisted guys by the chief of the boat to make sure that they were balanced, and the officers by the executive officer to make sure you had what you needed in port at all times. The topside watch in port was usually a second or third class petty officer with a .45 pistol and a control communications box that he could announce down there what was going on in topside if you needed anything. And his job was to make sure if anybody came on board, particularly the nukes, that they were on a qualified access list so that they were allowed to be on board the ship. And if they weren't, the topside watch's job was to make sure they didn't get on board the ship. Some of them really liked that job because it gave them a lot of authority and power, and they would enjoy making a commander show his ID card. Okay, life aboard the submarines. How many officers? And we'll let Jack talk here, but the diesel boats had about 9 to 12 officers.
That was heavy.
And that was heavy. Yeah.
That would be a heavy load.
So, and how many men? They were 80 to 90, depending. They're roughly like 8 or 9 to 1 crew to officers.
But
Okay, how big and where was your space? Sir?
if your bunk was your private space, and that was it.
Describe the head of a submarine. That's where you go to the toilet.
A mechanical nightmare. If you operated the valves wrong, whatever you did came back in your face. So it behooved you to learn how to do that.
Yeah, the sanitary tanks had to be able to withstand total pressure of the ship. And so if you needed to blow sanitaries, you had to pressurize the sanitary tank. But first you needed to hang a sign on all of the heads that said blowing sanitaries, and that told everybody, don't use the head right now, not a good idea. Okay.
Okay, for crew, on the diesel boats I was on, in the forward torpedo room was one head with a built-in shower, and that was for the officers. Back in the after battery, there were two heads and two showers for the 80 to 90 man crew. That included the chief petty officers. They were still enlisted, so they did all their business back there with us. Meal schedule on the diesel boats was we fed something every 4 hours. We had the three major meals for breakfast, lunch, dinner, on a basically schedule 8 a.m., noon, and 8 p.m. But then there was always something out because the crews were changing every 4 hours. You had another duty section coming on. Some guys wouldn't get up to eat at a main meal. They'd sleep through it and then grab a sandwich or something off watch meal. Well, like I said earlier, on the medical sport we had at sea was the corpsman.
And on the nuke boats, we had a corpsman, sometimes first class, seldom a chief, but on the Polaris submarines, the strategic missile submarines, we had a doctor on board, and one of my doctors performed a minor operation while we were at sea with the captain's permission. I'm not sure it was entirely necessary, but the guy was having trouble sitting down because of a cyst in the wrong place. Okay, what's the atmosphere like? That's an interesting question. Tell us a little bit about it, Jack.
Well, the atmosphere is closed. It smelled of diesel because that's where we were, a diesel boat. If we were snorkeling, we could get some fresh air in. If we weren't snorkeling, it got quite close and quite humid very quickly. So we like to snorkel a lot, or we like to be on the surface because then we could get fresh air.
Oh, what did I do? I turned it on. Okay, here we are. That's where we just finished. And in the nukes, we made our own atmosphere. We had oxygen generators, and we had carbon monoxide scrubbers and carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide burners and carbon dioxide scrubbers, because smoking was still allowed in that closed area. So, well, you could tell submariners as soon as they got off the submarine, they would go, "What's that funny smell?" It was fresh air. And the rest of them said, "Submariners." Okay, here we go. The first submarine for the U.S. Navy was a one-man crew, the Turtle, and it sort of floated, sort of went submerged, but the one-man crew was busy as a one-armed paper hanger. He had two oars to row with, a rudder to control the direction of the ship, a little screw there in the front to make the submarine go down or up, and a screw in the front to make the little submarine go forward. And it had a mine on the back of it, which was attached to a British warship and wasn't very successful. And that's what they looked like. It was just a thing wrapped with leather and goose grease and whatever to try to make it waterproof. And the Hunley, I told you there was a submarine for the Civil War. It had 12 men and 2 officers. It went out for one day and the whole crew was killed. They raised it up again and recruited somehow another 12 guys and 2 officers to go out to try to sink a U.S. northern ship. So here we have diesel submarine design, and I'm going to let Jack talk about that, and I'm going to try to point at what he's talking about. Or you want to point? Yeah. Let me turn the pointer on.
Start forward.
Microphone.
Sorry, we'll start forward. Forward torpedo room, there were 6 tubes. There was crews berthing up there. We've got a picture of that later a little bit. And then right after that is the forward battery. And above that was the officers' country, the officers' wardroom, their staterooms and that sort of thing. And then just after that is the control room underneath the conning tower, which is not really shown here. And that had the diving planes, emergency steering, lots of other stuff going on in there. Pump rooms, sonar rooms down, radio shack, usually just after the control room itself. And then you get into the after battery, which is the crew's messing area, crew's berthing, the galley, food storage down below, the battery, of course. And then you get into the forward engine room, after engine room. There are 4 very large diesels. These are the same things you see on trains, diesel trains, same engines. Some are the Fairbanks Morse 16-cylinder opposed, and some are the Jimmy V12 diesels. All they did was generate electricity. They were connected to generators. They didn't drive anything. The control or maneuvering room is where all of the electricity was routed as to what we were doing, and the drive motors down here back to the propellers. And then just after that is the after torpedo room, again, 4 tubes and also crew's berthing. And that basically was the diesel electric submarine World War II type. This still had the cigarette deck, we called it, with anti-aircraft guns fore and aft, and then the deck gun, which was usually a 5-inch a single shot. Those were taken away after the war, and you'll see that later. Oh, okay. They don't show it. Outside of this envelope are saddle tanks on the outside of the pressure hull itself. And we had fuel tanks, ballast tanks, trimming tanks, sanitary tanks, and the fuel tanks were open at the bottom. So as we drew the fuel off the top, water would come in, the seawater would come in and compensate for the loss of the weight.
This one just shows you how in the color code, the blue were the engines and the green were the batteries or the electric motors or the electric generators. So it's just an easier one to look at. So take notes, there'll be a quiz later. So how does a submarine work? Well, Archimedes, back in the old Greek days, had a Archimedes principle. It said if you have a submerged body, the buoyant force is exerted on that body immersed in a fluid, whether fully or partially submerged, is equal to the weight of the fluid that was in the body, the weight of the fluid displaced by the body. So here's how Jack was telling you about. This is how a submarine works. There are saddle tanks around the pressure hull, and when you're on the surface, the ballast tanks are filled with air, unless they're fuel ballast, in which case they're filled with fuel, with diesel fuel. If you want to dive, you open the valves at the very top, the main ballast tank valves, and you let air go out and water come in. And then the diving officer's job is to compensate for that so you can be at the depth that you want to be at. And when you want to surface, you just blow air into those saddle tanks and then you'll surface again.
There are three types of buoyancy on a submarine. There's the positive buoyancy, which means you're bobbing along on the surface. There's neutral buoyancy, which means you're underwater and staying underwater, hopefully at the depth that you want to be at. And then positive, which just means you've blown air into your ballast tanks and you're rising again.
So this is what a battery sort of looks like. They were about 1 by 2 feet by 5 or 6 feet, and they weighed several tons. And in each battery compartment, there was 250 of them. And so you get 2 volts, so you had 500 volts DC in each, from each battery compartment. And they had a lot of life to them, but you had to replace them every few years because they were just like the batteries in your car, lead acid batteries, but they were huge. And in the battery compartment, if you were going into the battery compartment, you had to take every piece of metal off of you and leave it out, your watch, your rings, and your belt buckle, because all of the terminals, as you can see, are on the top of the battery, and they're right there. If you got a piece of metal across a couple of those terminals, you have smoke, fire, and problems. So this was one of Jack's submarines, the Kubera on the surface. So you can see that after the war, they made some improvements. All of that set of pipes and everything that was poking up on top of the submarine is now enclosed with fair water to give you a little less resistance when going through the water submerged. And they have, this one has a low bridge. You can see the bridge right in front of the numbers. And at the very top of the bridge is where the periscopes and the masts and the antennas come out. Okay, Jack, you're on again.
Okay, this was didn't happen all that often, but when it did happen, it was a lot of fun. We actually would do barbecues. One time in the mud, we ran into a bunch of shrimp, and we had a huge barbecue. And unfortunately, we were sailing past the aircraft carrier. It was Sunday, and they were all in their best getting lined up to go to chow. And here we are looking like this, steaming by about 100 yards off. Needless to say, the admiral on board was not pleased.
Because he wasn't invited. Okay, Jack, you're on with the rooms.
Okay, this is a shot of the forward torpedo room looking forward at the torpedo tubes. Those are 2 on the top, 2 in the middle, and you don't see the 2 on the bottom, but there are 6 tubes up there. You also noticed the green, that's a bunk. That's where somebody slept. And right above them is a torpedo. And on to the side of them, you don't see, is a torpedo. We could reload 3 times. So we carried, if we went on war load, which we did twice on the boat I was on, we'd go out with all the tubes full of war shots, and then we'd have replacements for them back in the torpedo rooms. And this is the watertight hatch, which is been tested to our test depth, whatever it was on the boat we were on. And when we went to battle stations, we would have those dogged down so that if we lost a compartment, we didn't necessarily lose the whole sub. And this was, every compartment was done this way.
And each compartment had to be able to withstand test depth. And the heavy doors there, the watertight doors, and you can see you had to kind of step over, so you had to learn how to move around without knocking your shins or your head, because the doors weren't all that big. This is a sample of the officer's mess with an officer standing there, but you can see we had china, we had silver plate, we had service for soups and all the other spoons that go with a semi-formal meal, and the stewards would serve you like the people serve us here and take the plates away so you could start with soup and salad if you had any lettuce left when you were out at sea for a while, and go your way on through to dessert with different plates and forks and knives and all that stuff. And this is one, the size of it is typical for a newer submarine. You can seat about a dozen people or so, fairly comfortably. Okay, this is the commanding officer's stateroom, and he was by himself. He had his own bunk there, and it could fold down to be a table, and you can see that there are seats. There are seats here, so the table could serve as a divider, and the captain could have a little conference with one other person. And he had all of his controls. He could see how deep the submarine was, what speed it was making, what course, and he had communications with everybody right there. This is an XO stateroom. The executive officer is second in command, and there were typically, this would be the executive officer's bunk, and this upper bunk could be swung up and out of the way. When I was on Trout, my first submarine, really, I slept above the XO unless there was a senior officer riding, and then I slept next to my favorite torpedo. So he had a sink, and he had some storage and a safe that can be locked there for various kinds of classified material. This was an officer's stateroom. There's a lower bunk, middle bunk, and the upper bunk. And when I was on the Polaris submarine, I had the middle bunk because I was senior to the other two officers that were in the stateroom with me. This is chief's quarters. It shows you how they had a little more space, and they had a table where they could drink coffee or smoke or whatever.
I don't know which boat that was, but the boats I was on, there was no table in the goat locker. They were as crowded as we were.
Now we're at the control station. You want to talk about that, Jack?
Sure. What you're looking at on the left is the stern plane wheel, if you will. Just forward of that is the forward plane wheel. The ballast manifold and the Christmas tree lights that you see there. If it's green, they're open. If it's red, they're shut. So the chief of the boat would monitor that as we were diving to make sure that all the ballast tanks had the valves were open so we could actually do that. To the right is a gimbaled compass, and then that wheel you see is an emergency steering stand. The actual steering stand would be above this in the control conning tower. This is just one part of a very busy room. The other side is full of all kinds of stuff.
So this is a typical periscope stand, probably on a nuclear submarine because they're wearing poopy suits as opposed to uniforms, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Jack, you're on. This is your place.
This is the galley. This is actually looks like one of the ones I had. On the left-hand side, behind the guy, is the storage areas where you kept all that sort of stuff, work surfaces, the ovens and cook surfaces is what he's working on right there, and that was it. I mean, that's what we had. He's dressed up for the picture. I never wore a hat, and I never wore a blue shirt. I was always in an undershirt when I was working.
Because it was hot.
This is a cruise mess, 4 table, like I said. We could feed 6 people per table. So that's, and then I'm not sure where this boat was, but those were actual, the tabletops we had, the AC/DC chessboard, checkers board were built into the tabletops, and there'd be four of those in the after battery. And after battery cruise berthing, as you can see, you had to be friendly on a submarine.
This is another area of cruise berthing. Not sure just where it was, but they're very close all the time.
And a shower, guy reaching out of the shower to the wash basin. The only person on board that got to shower every day was me when I was baking. The crew insisted that the cook, the baker, be clean for some strange reason.
This is a
And,
typical diesel engine engine room. And on the left is the Fairbanks Morse 16-cylinder ones, and on the right is the General Motors V12s.
now,
And
the
we
way
had to
we
learn
started the way we started these babies is you took that handle and you flipped it all the way over to start, and it would hit the pistons with compressed air to get them moving, and then you'd inject the diesel into them. And the diesel was clean when it came out of the fuel tanks with a centrifuge to get the water out of it, because it would mix with water. So we'd separate the water out and then shoot diesel in. And this is back in the maneuvering room, we called it, and that's where the electricians, that was the electrician's haven. I used to go through that room as quick as I could. It was just smelled bad. And then those are the handles you see are the ability to shoot the electricity wherever you wanted it to go.
And you probably can't see it, but right here, these gauges say kiloamp, so they're 1,000 amp measuring. And then the after torpedo room.
Right. And the four tubes, you can see all four tubes. They've got the spare, well, you can see on the left upper tube, there's a torpedo in there. You can see its propellers. But they've got the reload benches pulled out, and it could be because they were loading torpedoes that day.
Okay, so this was my first submarine after the Naval Academy, the USS Trout. It was designed with improvements from the German submarines, and we had 3 diesel engines, and we had a 36-inch snorkel pipe, so we could run all 3 engines submerged. But if you did that, you left a wake that you could see from Mars. Okay, here is some pictures of the surface. The first one on the upper left shows some people on deck, and frequently the Filipino stewards would like to get on deck in the morning after we were driving on the surface, because there would frequently be flying fish on deck, and they would make their special fish food with the flying fish. The bottom photo shows the Trout coming into Suda Bay, Crete. I was sent out on this Greek submarine because I was the most junior officer in all of the Atlantic submarine fleet, including the Pacific. There were 2 other officers from the Naval Academy sent directly to submarines. They stood higher in the class than I did, so they were technically senior to me. The next picture, this is what a submarine looks like submerged. And if you have really good eyes and look right down there, whoop, there's a red circle that shows the periscope sticking out above the water. Okay, we're going to rush through the rest of this stuff here. This was submarine explosive shock trials off of Key West, and I was officer in charge of the boat to pull the line out and stretch it out so it would be nice and straight, and the captain could drive through where the little flags were that he had to go through. and then they set off the explosive. And you know what happens when you set off explosives? You get fish. The first day was, I was the junior officer of the deck with the captain, and he said, Mr. Wynn, lay below and organize the fish recovery party. And so I did, and we had fish frequently. So racing through this, how many officers? This was the wardroom. Here's the captain, the executive officer, and the navigator, the top 3 officers, and all the rest of us. There were 14 of us on board. So there were 3 4-man staterooms, and the captain and the XO had their own stateroom, and it adjoined, and between their 2 staterooms was their head and shower. So how many men? Around 90 or so, 110, 120 people on the Polaris submarine. We wore poopy suits, which were nylon coveralls, and we had nylon underwear because it wouldn't make lint in the dryer system on the submarine. How big and where was my space? I showed you the officers' quarters where there were 3 bunks stacked up. In my room, there was a very small desk and a little place to store some other clothes, hanging gear locker. Medical support, that tallest guy in the first picture was a doctor, and he was about as crazy as the rest of us. It used to be said that you don't have to be crazy to be in submarines, but it helps. So again, the head was a little bit different because we had more room in the nuke, and we had a shower for the officers and a head and a urinal. And when I talked to students in Citrus County about submarines, and they asked if there were women on board, a young lady asked me, and I said, no, it's very quiet, close quarters, not much room, you know, for anything. She said, well, you could take out the urinals, we don't need them. So officers could take a shower periodically, you know, once a week or whatever seemed appropriate. And our meal schedule was 6-hour schedule. So every 6 hours there was a main meal, and at midnight there were mid-rats. And that's where Jack would come in, because he would make the sticky buns and the donuts and all the good stuff in the middle of the night for the crew coming on. This was crew's mess in a nuke. It's somewhat bigger. There's more room for everything. This was my Polaris submarine. I had 16 A2 nuclear-tipped missiles, and our job was to be ready to blow up whatever they wanted us to blow up. Fortunately, we didn't do that. This, you don't need to look at this, but this shows, this is the missile compartment. So if you take a standard submarine and cut everything aft of here and slide the rest of it back, you can put in your missile tubes. And when they made the Seawolf, the first nuclear submarine, they had a regular World War II diesel boat, and they cut it apart and took the engine rooms out and put in the nuclear power plant and welded it all back together again. So this was my submarine in dry dock in the Holy Loch, Scotland. You can see this is where the pressure hull is, and then above and around that would be the ballast tanks, and here's the flat deck behind where the missile hatches opened up. And if we had to go to emergency quarters, we would go to 100 feet, and we had a hovering control system which sort of worked and would hold us at 100 feet. And you had to go to less than 1 knot forward speed, or the missile would be torqued coming out of this tube. So you had to hover, then launch your missiles. And I launched one at the Cape, and that's a picture my mother took. When she went down to the Cape, they took her out on a ship, and they were able to watch the launch. I shot that missile without a nuclear warhead, and it landed somewhere in the South Atlantic, which was basically what we were doing. Okay, this is the attack boat. You see it has a rounded front. It's got a spherical sonar. You could listen in all directions except directly behind you. and the rest of it you don't need to worry about. So this was the Tenosa. I was executive officer from 69 to 72. And we went to sea in 72, and that's when Carol went home in 71, 72, because the lease on our house ran out on the beach at York Harbor, Maine. And she went home and got her master's degree and stayed with her parents, and they loved it. She's an only child, and we had an only child, and the oldest grandson around for the rest of the family. So life was good. They got to see the grandkid. This, you remember all of the wheels and the valves and everything else in the diesel submarine? This is what looks like the ballast control panel and the diving station. Here's the helmsman, the fairwater planes operator, the stern planes, the diving officer, and the chief of the watch, all watching what's going on. And it's all digital, no more of the hand-controlled valves. So you have to be careful where you are because we can show up anywhere. We'll entertain questions. Pam, are you going to run around with a mic? Thank you. I see a hand over there. It's hooked up to somebody.
Questions? You got one? Okay.
Actually, Walter, I've got a million questions, but we'll start with this one. Initially, for an officer to go on a nuclear submarine, he had to be interviewed by Admiral Rickover. Did you have to go through that process?
Oh, of course, everybody did. And I was at Cornell working on my PhD at the time, and we got orders to go down. Charlie McVeigh, who wrote this book, and I went down, and they said, "Are you a volunteer?" And I said, "Yes." "Well, we don't have any paperwork on that." I said, I had asked the yeoman to pull out the papers so I could volunteer. So they said, "Okay." And you had to be interviewed. One of my interviews was by a chemist who had gone to Cornell. We talked about Cornell. Another was a nuclear physicist. We talked about my dissertation on experimental reactor physics. And there were 2 or 3 other senior officers there, or civilians, that interviewed me. And I went in to see the old man. And you go in, and there's an officer witness comes in because there were so many tales about how he disabused young officers. So the guy said, "Go in, sit in the chair, don't say anything." So I went down, sat down, and the admiral was turned over at his desk. He was looking at something, probably had nothing to do with me. "You married Wynn?" "No, sir. That's all." That was my entire interview.
Just one other question. You didn't talk about fresh water on the submarine, how you get fresh water.
We had in the diesel boats, we had a little vapor compression still that we could use to make fresh water, and battery water quality and limited. And the chief of the boat would frequently find some guy other than Jack had taken a shower, and he would send him back there to stand a 4-hour watch in that hot area, making sure that the water level was right and he was getting fresh water out. In the nukes, we had a very large distiller system to distill battery water capable fresh water. And we had pretty much unlimited fresh water. So, showers when you needed them. And sometimes the chief of the boat would encourage a particular person to have a shower. Did they do the bristle brush showers?
I'm sorry?
Did they do the bristle brush showers where they go in with no soap and no water, and there's a bristle brush, and you brush the guy down and he remembers? Any other questions?
Well, Bud beat me to the punch, and you've answered it pretty well. But I was going to also talk about the showers and fresh water, which is a very precious commodity on naval vessels. with evaporators and, as you said, a distilling station. You might want to talk about, you apparently never had to do it, Walter, but I bet you did, about what a Navy shower is. But specifically, did you ever have the evaps crap out and have to take saltwater showers?
No, but I believe we had saltwater soap. Did you have saltwater soap on the diesel boats?
I'm
No.
sorry?
Saltwater soap. So we would stop in the middle of the ocean. I've been swimming in like 6,000 foot depth water, and you jump over the side, and then you can shower. You can use the saltwater soap and jump back in and hope it gets washed off. But you're still salty at the end of that evolution.
Okay.
Could you talk about claustrophobia? Is that an issue at all, or?
It could be an issue, but all of the troops went through, you had a psychological exam?
I'm sorry?
You had a psychological exam to go into submarines? at sub school?
Yeah, cursory. Basically, they weeded you out in sub school, and when you went out on the sub school boats, they would take you out on day trips. And what they were looking for mainly was claustrophobia. And if you didn't freak out and you could operate and do what they told you to do, then they figured you're okay.
And in the submarines, because the Navy is all volunteer and submarines all volunteer on top of it, we had the ability to surface someone who did not fit in. If there was a problem and the chief of the boat said, this guy needs to go, he was gone. One time when I was a lieutenant, we were in overhaul in New London, and we were trying to get rid of a guy, and the psychologist came down to the ship to talk to us, and he said, what do you want me to say about this guy? And so basically we could get rid of anybody that was a problem. And I told you that my submarine, the last one, was the sister ship of the Thresher, and we were the first submarine of the class to undergo a sub-safe overhaul, to go out, to go down where the Thresher went and go to test depth and do all the operations that we were supposed to do. And there was an E8 chief electrician's mate who said, I'm not going. He had friends on the Thresher and that he knew, and he was there at Portsmouth when the Thresher went down, and he said, I'm not going to sea with you. And the captain wanted not to re-enlist him, but the Bureau of Naval Personnel said, you have to re-enlist him, but you can surface him. So we surfaced him. So here was an E8 electrician going to surface warfare ship that he didn't know anything about. So any other questions?
Walter, we have several questions online on
Okay.
Zoom. Can you read them, or do you want me to read them for you?
You better read them.
Okay, the first one, you mentioned that the TDU/GDU and how it worked.
I didn't mention that. That was a trash disposal unit. It's like a vertical torpedo tube where you can load soft garbage in the bottom and then some weights, and then garbage and plastic mesh bags, and then you fill it up. And you have to get permission from the officer of the deck and the captain, because you have to break dive conditions in order to shoot the GDU out the bottom. And so that was a periodic time. What'd you guys have on the diesel boat? Throw it over the side?
It was the same thing. We had a GDU right by the mess, vertical torpedo tube as it were. We had the nylon mesh bags, but we'd take a keg of railroad spikes and put a railroad spike in it to make sure it sank, and then get permission when we were, if we were on the surface, we'd just go up and throw them overboard. But if we were submerged, then we'd use the GDU, and we'd have to get permission again from the officer of the deck to, or the diving officer, to open it up and do it. And it flushed. We didn't really use compressed air. We pumped water through to get it out.
Did you guys have water hours where fresh water was shut down for hours?
No, we used salt water to flush GDU.
And salt water to flush the head. But I never ran into having water hours, but if you were running short of fresh water, the engineer would have to go to the captain and say, we're having a problem, we have shortage of fresh water, we need to go on water hours. And that meant you could wash your hands, maybe not shave, certainly not take a shower. But the cooks had everything they needed to make food.
Right, the fresh water on the boats I was on was a scarce commodity. We could only make a couple 100 gallons a day. So it was rationed.
Next.
What was the longest you stayed under without surfacing, or is that still classified?
It's not classified. The Polaris submarines had 2 crews, and you would change the crew. You would spend a week with them in port, going over everything that needed to be fixed. And then you would fix everything. Then you'd go out for 2 or 3 days to refresh your operations in submerged. We go out and do a test dive and test blow the ballast tanks and do the things we needed to do, come back in port, do a final refit and final load out of foods and fresh vegetables and whatever. And in some cases, we would take the forward escape hatch and purge it with nitrogen and put the cabbage up there because it would be stored in nitrogen, it wouldn't rot, and you could save 2 or 3 more weeks of fresh vegetables by doing that. Next.
Last question, did lack of sun ever become an issue?
Say that again?
Did lack of sun, I think they mean sunshine,
Oh.
ever become an issue?
No, we didn't have it, but sometimes on the diesel boats, if we're on the surface, somebody would request permission to come up to the bridge and sit in the sunshine. So, but we didn't have any solar beds or sun lamps or anything like that. Anything else?
Any
Well-
other questions? Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for
Appreciate it, guys.
coming.